Mondo reading group, picking up again in the new year. We've been a little bit sporadic the last month or so with people, having holidays and not being able to attend. But we're going to try to get through the next couple of sections and finish off volume 2 of Individuation. So we're picking up from page 656 of the PDF. Continuing on analysis of the criteria of individuality, and we're at the section heading Principle of Study Concerning the Individual. So I think, let me just take a look at what we looked at last time. So we saw, so this text is a little bit strange, I think. It's kind of a dense text, but it's also, I guess, a little bit disjointed in the sense that each of these sections is a little bit not entirely independent of the others, of course, but it doesn't have a sort of single line of argument that goes through the whole text, I don't think. So he introduces his idea of taking this paradigm from the sciences, but he takes it to be he takes the development of science to be not from sort of concrete realities and then abstracting from it and producing hypotheses in abstraction from observations. He instead takes it that the progress of science or the development of sciences occurs through the progressive realization of hypotheses. So there's a hypothesis that is abstract at the outset. So like the atomic hypothesis in ancient Greece was essentially just an intellectual construction. And then as science develops and progresses, that hypothesis becomes more and more concrete and actually realizes itself. So the development of science is not something like a sort of intellectual adequation. It's actually a realization. It's a production of realities that corresponds to this hypothesis from the outset. And so, in the case of the atomistic hypothesis, when this hypothesis is sort of revived in the 19th century, it's now sort of put into the statistical form. So you can, for example, deduce the properties of gases based on statistical distributions of molecules. And then over the course of the 20th century, it becomes even more concrete in the sense that now scientists and engineers are able to physically manipulate individual molecules and atoms. So I mentioned a famous demonstration that some IBM researchers did in the 90s, where they actually used individual atoms to draw the IBM logo. Sort of, I think it was like 20 atoms or something like that to draw the IBM logo that you could see with an electron microscope. So, and then there was a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now, a publication of some researchers who were able to set up an apparatus that could rotate individual molecules clockwise or counterclockwise on command. So the capacity to manipulate individual atoms or individual molecules is a kind of concretization of the atomistic hypothesis. It's taking this, what was an abstract intellectual hypothesis, and actually producing realities that correspond to it. And so he sees this concretization process as being the general sort of form of scientific development, as opposed to coming to more and more abstract laws, which is maybe a more traditional picture of scientific development. And in the case of philosophy, what this means is that we have to consider even sort of abstract metaphysical or epistemological theses. We have to consider them in terms of the axiological consequences that we can draw from them. So it has to do with taking these abstract theses and having them bring about some sort of transformation of reality through human action. there's a kind of self-justifying nature to these abstract metaphysical and epistemological theses. So they sort of realize themselves in reality, as opposed to having a kind of correspondence to something that exists outside of our thought. So it's not the case that we come up with a metaphysical thesis and then sort of compare it with reality and see does it match or not. What instead happens in philosophical thinking is that we come up with a metaphysical thesis and then we actually transform reality in such a way as to make it align with that metaphysical thesis through human action. So that's this sort of self-justifying character of philosophical thought. Yes, and I should maybe explain that axiology it would be a philosophy of value. So and we talked about this a little bit in when we read volume 1. So any sort of action that you take, including an omission of action or a refusal of action, is sort of implicit selection of values, or implicitly a relation with a value. So if you choose to go to university instead of joining the army, or vice versa, you're implicitly saying that going to university is better, is a of higher value than joining the army, or vice versa. And whichever sort of course of action you select is one that you're sort of implicitly acting in accordance with a valuation of those courses of action. And so, of course, most of our daily actions are of relatively limited valuation, sort of, I guess, potential. So if you choose to have X for lunch instead of Y, it's not a particularly important decision in terms of valuing one food over the other. But when we think about big life decisions about whether to join the army or not, or whatever other sort of whether to get married or divorced, these types of decisions involve some sort of hierarchization of values, where you say this action has a higher value, or is aligned with a higher value than the other course of action. And ultimately we can understand this hierarchization of values in connection with metaphysical and epistemological theses, in the sense that by selecting one action over another, you are by that selection you are saying that one of those courses of action has a higher value than the other. But this is sort of a consequence of what kind of metaphysical bearing each of these courses of action has on the nature of human existence, for example. So if you think that human existence, sort of the fundamental characteristic of human existence is a search for knowledge, then you might select the course of action of going to university and studying philosophy or physics or whatever. But if you think that the fundamental determination of human nature is something different than the search for knowledge, then maybe you don't go to university. And so each of those decisions sort of corresponds to an understanding of what human existence consists in. And so in that sense, each of these valuations sort of implicitly has a metaphysical component to it as well. Okay, so let's start on the text. Let me read the next page or so, because we have a short section, then a longer section. So I'll read about a page. Okay, principle of study concerning the individual. On whichever level it may be apprehended, the reality of the individual is from the start governed by an external and negative principle that can be called the principle of energetic determinism, or rather the principle of energetic conservation. If we consider a physical system from a macroscopic point of view, the principle of the conservation of energy, which, if we want to be absolutely rigorous, is generalized by the introduction of a parameter that expresses in units of energy the variations of mass that the system could undergo during energetic transformations is absolutely valid, i.e., without considering the becoming internal to the system, according to which individuals appear or disappear during the course of various successive transformations. It would no doubt be illusory to research the profound essence of the individual in an exception to the principle of energetic determinism, even by affirming that this exception is extraordinarily slight, as Bergson wants to do, in order to safeguard the notion of psychical freedom. At a time when the notion of kinetic energy wasn't clearly defined or precisely measured and was confused with quantity of movement, Descartes held strong in the belief of creating the possibility of an absolute initiative of the res cogitans that was dependent on the capacity of imposing a variation of direction with an increase or decrease of labor in the least dense parts of the body, i.e., in the animal spirits, which are rigorously those of res extensa and do not in any way participate in the res cogitans. Undoubtedly, the principle of inertia does not allow us to follow Descartes in this theory of the relation between two substances, but the example of Cartesian thought with all the efforts meant to resolve the difficulties of bisubstantialism is an exemplary illustration of a labor intended to found a theory of the distinction and relations between the essential interiority of an indivisible being and the rest of the entire world. We should particularly note that Descartes does not seek to found the distinction on the one hand and the relation on the other hand upon two different principles, which would amount to introducing a facility. Descartes struggles against such a facility when he refuses to resort to impressed species, which would have easily offered him a reference to scholastic doctrines. Since he refused the apparent simplification that would have been a recourse to the mixture as a mediate term of the relation between the substances of thought and extension, Descartes had to allow a flaw to remain in his system. But at the cost of this imperfection, a unity of method infinitely rich in signification and fruitful in developments is kept intact. The principle of conservation is guaranteed for the substance, thought, as well as the substance extension. Descartes particularly developed the consequences of the principle of conservation in the domain of physical quantities that measure the modifications of res extensa, theory of simple machines, whereas Malebranche applied this same principle of conservation to the modifications of the res cogitans, particularly in the study of attention. In Descartes, since there is no conservation of what we today call work, the displacement of the point of application of a force whose direction is parallel to this displacement is inversely proportionate to the intensity of the force. Similarly, in Malebranche, the extension of the known object and the intelligible clarity of the thought that knows it varies in inverse proportion, just as the intensity of illumination produced by a bundle of light varies in inverse proportion to the area it illuminates. Thought is conserved, but it can become concentrated through focalization or spread out through diffusion. Yeah, let's stop here. So this is a sort of long paragraph as we so often come across in Simondon. So here we have, so first there's a criticism of Bergson or any sort of attempt to understand the freedom of the individual or the autonomy of an individual, in Bergson it's a human individual as a free being, but any sort of attempt to grasp the autonomy of an individual, whether human or otherwise, as something like a deviation from determinism. So for Simondon, this is sort of a dead end, not really a productive way of understanding the autonomous reality of an individual. And he illustrates this by looking at Descartes' attempt to explain the action of the human will in relation to the operation of the human body. And so for Descartes, he gives this explanation in terms of which the quantity of movement is constant. So the human will can't actually change the quantity of movement in the universe. It's not the case that the human will sort of brings about an addition to the quantity of movement or a subtraction from the quantity of movement in the universe. But what the human will can do is to change the direction of movement of the animal spirits in the nervous system. So the actual total quantity stays the same, but the direction of the movement of those animal spirits can be deviated by the action of the human will. And so because in Descartes' system, it's only the quantity of movement that's conserved, the actual direction of that movement can be changed without any loss or any sort of physical work being required. But what Simondon points out here is that the animal spirits in our nervous system are fundamentally portions of res extensa in Descartes' system, and so ultimately there's no reason why the human will should be able to act on the animal spirits any more than it can act on the muscles or the bones or any other part of the human body. There's no even it's a sort of illusory intermediation. So we think of these animal spirits as very very fine or very subtle matter, as Descartes calls them. But that doesn't make them, in reality, any closer to the human will or the res cogitans. They're just as diverse or disparate from the res cogitans as any other portion of res extensa. So Descartes' solution is ultimately not a real solution. He just says that the human will does have this capacity to change the direction of the animal spirits in the nerves, but this is sort of a bare assertion. There's no reason why this connection should apply to the animal spirits as opposed to any other portion of res extensa. And so, but Simondon recognizes that this sort of obscurity of the connection between res cogitans and res extensa in Descartes' system is kind of compensated by the fact that each side within res cogitans and res extensa, each treated independently, there's this principle of conservation. So in the case of res extensa, it's the conservation of the quantity of movement, and this is the one that Descartes focuses on. But then in the res cogitans, we would have a sort of equivalent conservation of attention, and this is what Malebranche develops more than Descartes does. So there would be, for example, attention would be something that can be spread out over a wide domain. So you can sort of pay attention to many different things, or a large sort of subdomain of reality. But then each portion of that subdomain would have a lesser degree of attention devoted to it. Or alternatively, you can pay attention to one particular thing or one small portion of reality, and then you would have a larger degree of attention devoted to that portion of reality. So there's a sort of inverse relationship between the amount or the portion of reality that you are paying attention to and the intensity of that intention applied to that portion of reality. Okay, so let's continue from there. So if someone else can pick up from furthermore, Descartes.
Yeah, I can read. Furthermore, Descartes had already employed this principle of the conservation of the same quantity of thought by establishing the rules of reasoning. Straightforward and constructive reasoning draws its fruitfulness from the fact that it is not tautology. But precisely due to this, it cannot control its validity by means of the principle of identity. In fact, Descartes resorts to a principle that is analogous to the principle of conservation in simple machines, in the same way that the Cartesian machine is one that operates a transformation through which work is conserved, because the machine is in a state of continuous equilibrium throughout the transformation. Reasoning is rigorous when it operates a quote-unquote transfer of evidence from one proposition to the next. Cartesian reasoning does not depend on identity but on equivalence. It operates a lossless transfer of sense from one proposition to the sense of the following proposition. This is why a doctrine like that of animals-machines seemed natural to Descartes. A mechanistic representation of vital operations to him was not able to seem like a reduction to an inferior level of reality, since thought itself unfolds in its most authentic operations according to a principle of conservation analogous to what is at work in machines, which are simple and consequently perfect. Nevertheless, Cartesian thought seems to have been unable to push the principle of conservation to its ultimate consequences. It announced two particular principles of conservation, one for res extensa, the other for res cogitans. and it only attempted a generalization of the principle of conservation in the cases of exchanges between the two substances. Prominent in Descartes toward the end of his life, this is the meaning of the tendency to admit the existence of an idea of the union of the soul and the body. But this doctrine was not fully explained, and it is instead in Spinoza's doctrines of psychophysiological parallelism or Leibniz's concrete individual notion that the extension of this line of research could be followed. Only Descartes' ethics could shed light on this subject, specifically the one that emerges from the passions of the soul, or from his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth. The very fact that Descartes does not wish to absolutely distinguish the foundation of the judgment of perfection from that of judgment of reality, reveals the possibility of a transfer that legitimizes an extension of the principle of conservation. Furthermore, the two demonstrations of the existence of God depend on such a principle. For the demonstration of the fifth meditation would fall under Kant's assault if it did not depend on that of the third meditation. The ontological transfer is valid because a first transfer has been defined and carried out. That which leads from infinity and from perfection, grasped not as concepts separate from their object but as veritable realities, the whole of divinity, of which they are already integrating parts. Transfer is possible because there is a passage not from the concept to the thing, but from a partial reality to a total reality. Judgment does not change modality at any moment. The approach begins and ends in epistemological realism, insofar as this approach is not a deduction but a transfer. The ontological argument is only valid to the extent that it utilizes the reversibility of an already accomplished transfer, just as in a simple machine, motor work can be converted into resistant work through a slight change in the direction of displacement, which is the description of the very condition of reversibility. Thus, in Cartesianism, we have the example of a thought that utilized a principle of conservation due to which relations other than identity or alterity, i.e., the equivalence or transfer of properties from part to whole, can be thought logically. Descartes went as far as contemplating the rapport between an operation and a structure, which was taken up by Spinoza in his theory of path breaking, intended to explain habits and corporeal memory, with this ever-present preoccupation with reversibility, due to which an act gives rise to the determination of a trace, and the trace gives rise to the further determination of an act. The idea of thought working by lossless transfer in deduction is also something that he talked about in History of the Notion of the Individual in the Descartes section. It's interesting to me that this seems to be what guarantees the validity of synthetic propositions. And I don't totally understand how it's supposed to ground the ontological argument. And if I remember correctly, Kant's objection to this is that that being is not a predicate. Being is a kind of postulation, and so you can't go from the idea of a being that has every predicate to the necessity of that being's existence.
Yeah. So there's a few kind of difficult abstract concepts at work in this section that maybe we can go over. Kant's criticism of actually, maybe I should start with Descartes' two arguments for the existence of God. I meant to look these up, but I didn't go through them, so I'm just doing this from memory. But if I remember correctly, the argument in the third meditation has to do with the existence within us or within myself as the thinking subject. So this is after I've performed the cogito, so I know that I exist at least. That's one thing that I can know for sure. And then I find within myself the idea of a perfect being, of an infinite being, I should say. And given that I myself am finite, this idea of an infinite being has to come from outside of me. And so he argues that ultimately this idea of an infinite being has to come from the infinite being itself. It has to come from a being that does have infinite reality. And so here we have a sort of principle of convertibility, which Descartes doesn't explicitly state, but it's the idea that the content of an idea that has the infinite as its content itself has infinite reality. So if I have an idea of the infinite, of an infinite being, then the reality of that idea itself, so the idea as a component of my mental existence or something along those lines, that idea itself has infinite reality. And since I'm a finite being, I can't my finite existence can't be the cause of this infinite idea, this idea with infinite reality. And so it's only an infinite being that can be the cause of an idea that has infinite reality, such as the idea of an infinite being. So that's the argument in the third meditation. And then the argument of the fifth meditation is the more traditional ontological argument, which is that God as a being, so if we define God or if we understand God as the being that contains all perfections or all realities, since existence is a perfection, then that being must exist. Or to put it alternately, if we conceive of a being that is supposed to be perfect but that does not exist, then it would be possible to think of a more perfect being, which would be one that has all those same perfections but does exist. So the concept of a most perfect being that does not exist is a contradiction in terms, because we can always conceive of a more perfect being as one that does exist. And that's the sort of classic ontological argument that Descartes takes on. And then Kant criticizes that argument, that ontological argument, in along the lines that you suggested, Angus. So he argues that being is not a predicate. So you can't take a subject like God, or an entity like God, and then say that being is a predicate that we attribute to that subject. Instead, he wants to think of so his sort of example for or his analogy that he wants us to draw is if you take the concept of $100, or Talers in his usage in German. The concept of $100 doesn't differ in any way from the actuality of $100, or 100 possible dollars and 100 actual dollars don't differ in any conceptual terms. Otherwise, if there were a difference in concept, then the 100 actual dollars would not correspond to the 100 possible dollars. So you have to take it that the conceptual determination of 100 possible dollars is identical to the conceptual determination of 100 actual dollars. But of course, when we are dealing with actual debts and payments and so on, there's all the difference in the world between 100 possible dollars, or $100 that I conceive of, and 100 actual dollars that I can use to make a payment. So Kant takes this to be a sort of illustration of the fact that the reality of those, or actuality of those $100, is not something conceptual. It's something, it has to do with existence outside the concept. And how exactly we're meant to grasp this existence outside the concept is something that Kant leaves somewhat obscure, but he takes it that sensibility is essential to grasping the existence of something outside the concept. So it's only insofar as we can connect our conceptual determination with some sort of sensible affection of ourselves, that we can attribute to it existence outside the concept. And because the ontological argument is meant to be purely a priori, so it's something that works at the level of the concept only. It doesn't allow us to attribute existence outside the concept to God, and so Kant takes this argument to be invalid for that reason. And there's a whole sort of logical tradition of in 19th century, especially German logical writers, of examining the form of the existential proposition. So to say that a proposition like God exists or $100 exists or whatever, what exactly are you asserting in making that kind of when you say something of that form? And so, for example, Frege will argue that um, uh, existential judgments are actually second order judgments about concepts. So when you say that, um, you know, there is a unicorn, for example, or unicorns exist, or something along those lines, what you're saying is that the concept unicorn is instantiated, or there is at least one entity such that the concept unicorn applies to that entity. Um, and so likewise in the ontological arguments, if you say God exists, you're saying that there is at least one entity such that the concept God applies to that entity. And if we take it that existential judgments have this kind of form, then we can see why the why existence is not a predicate, or being is not a predicate. So when we say God exists, it has the sort of surface form of being a predication of some property to the entity God, and then you can sort of develop the whole argument from there. But if you analyze the more sort of underlying grammar or underlying logical structure of the proposition, what instead you're saying is there is an entity such that the concept God applies to that entity, and then so you're already in that in asserting that sentence, you're already asserting that the entity exists. So you can't use that you can't use that as a premise to show that the entity exists because you're already asserting it in the premise. So that's sort of the Fregean development of that Kantian argument against the ontological argument. Um, uh, but what Simondon argues here is that the argument in the third meditation, Descartes' argument in the third meditation, serves as sort of the basis for the ontological argument in the fifth meditation. So what he's saying, as far as I understand, is that what Descartes is doing is not the move that Kant takes him to be doing, from the realm of the concept to the realm of actual existence. There's no passage from one realm to another, or one sort of logical domain to the other in Descartes. Instead, what he's doing is always operating at the level of he's always staying within the realm of the substance thought. So he's looking at the quantity of reality contained in an idea, and so in the third meditation, he argues that the quantity of reality contained in the idea of infinite being is something that it surpasses my capacity as a finite being to produce or to bring about. And then in the fifth meditation, he's still operating with the concept, or he's still operating in the domain of thought, and he's saying that the quantity of reality contained in the idea of a most perfect being that does exist is greater than the quantity of reality contained in the concept of a perfect being that does not exist. And so ultimately, we have to take the perfect being that does exist as being the fundamental reality from which our concept of the perfect being derives. And so it's this sort of transfer of validity, of this transfer of the quantity of reality contained in an idea, that Simondon takes to be sort of the general schema of Cartesian deduction, as opposed to a sort of ontological passage from the domain of the concept or the realm of thought to existence outside the concept, which is what Kant takes Descartes to be doing. So that's, I think, sort of the picture of what Simondon's argument is here. But so it's quite compressed, but that's sort of the background that Simondon is working with. Okay, so let's go on to the next. I think, the we can read the rest of this text up to the end of the text. So, Ollie, if you would like to read from Such as the Path.
Okay, such as the path opened for the most part by Descartes that we will attempt to follow by engaging a theory of the individual. But the principle of conservation cannot suffice alone to found this research, since it is essentially negative. It prohibits supposing the intervention of a foreign term in the relation of the individual to the milieu, in the relation of the individual to itself, or in the relation of the individual to another individual, but it does not allow for the description of what the individual is considered in its structure and its operations. This path makes it possible, with great difficulty to rigorously constitute a hierarchy of different levels of individuality and act more like an epistemological precaution than a constitutive principle. This is why the second principle, which is essentially positive, will not be able to be discovered in the simple formal inspection of the conditions of knowledge of the individual, but will have to be sought in the direct analysis of the simplest forms of the individuality, grasped by way of the conditions of their genesis. In this sense, it will attempt to establish that there is on the very level of physical individuality a certain bundle of conditions that cannot be conflated with the essence of the individual, but are more than a simple occasion of the individual's production, since they extend their existence after the appearance of the individual as individual's inherent characteristics. The individual incorporates and concretizes conditions under which it has been born, such that we can contemplate the genesis of the individual as a sort of transfer of reality, another distribution of matter and energy with a relative reversibility of conditions, the conditioned. In this sense, the genesis of the individual cannot be identified with an empirical and exterior description of conditions. The genesis of the individual must be envisioned as a change of state in which the initial state is not the cause of the final state, but rather its anterior equivalent. If this point of view is acceptable, it leads not just to the consideration of every individual as a complementary of a milieu, but also allows us to compare the asymmetrical ensemble formed by the individual and its complementary milieu with another ensemble, i.e. the initial system on the basis of which is constituted the passage to the second state of the system, in which the individual is distinct from its milieu. We will therefore treat the genesis of the individual by way of the theory of equivalence in exchanges involving the transformation of a system, since the theory can be called Allegmatics.
Right. Yeah, so this last bit is quite dense as well and a little bit obscure, I think. So Simondon here is introducing some, I think, familiar themes from Volume 1 that we looked at, this notion of the individual as a result of, the individual and the milieu as the complementary pair that result from the process of genesis out of something pre-individual, a pre-individual reality. So this is a familiar idea from Volume 1, but he's here connecting it in a not entirely clear way, or at least not clear to me, with the Cartesian concept that he developed earlier about this transfer of reality. But I think maybe the idea is that the total quantity of reality that is contained in the pre-individual reality is conserved in the complementary pair of the individual and milieu that arises out of that genesis from the pre-individual reality. So when we look at the individual, we have to understand that individual in relation or in connection with its surrounding milieu and the total quantity of reality contained in the individual and the milieu, and not just look at the individual in isolation. And it's only when we grasp the individual and the milieu together that we can affect this sort of transfer of reality from the pre-individual reality through this process of genesis into the individual and the milieu. I think that may be something like the kind of connection that Simondon is trying to draw here with the Cartesian method, between his method and the Cartesian method, but I'm not 100% confident about that interpretation.
Well, what I'm thinking about this part is that my question is that whether Simondon is trying to define how to say, like, the world, or the world is a variety of individuals, so as a patchwork. So it's kind of like focused on the variety, and then its value of a variety of individuals. Or another idea is that, thinking about the individuality or individual, if you think of one individual, then other than the individual, other parts, except for that individual, other parts can be regarded as the milieu. Then at the end of the day, the world is just a milieu. Like, environment means, like, unless we focus on particular individual, how can we distinguish like individual versus milieu? So what I want to say here is that, except for a particular individual, other than that, all the parts should be or can be defined as a milieu. And in that case, milieu is like all the combination, all the composition of individuals, or other than the individuals, there could be other aspects or other elements or components. So it's kind of suddenly, like, kind of confusing, like, how, what I understood about Simondon is he tried to emphasize the something new from the existing by emphasizing the genesis. I mean, the ontogenesis, emphasizing ontogenesis. But at the same time, by reading this part, suddenly, like, I am kind of confused how we distinguish, like, the milieu and individual, and then what kind of individual should be focused on, and every individual is important, such and such.
Yeah, there's a few important questions in your comments there that I think are worth going into. So maybe the first one we can look at is the distinction between milieu and individual. So I think you're right to say that in some sense this distinction is relative to an individual. So it's only if you first isolate an individual reality, so a human individual or a crystal or an organism or whatever sort of domain of reality you're looking at. So you first have to isolate, here's the individual that I'm interested in, and then in relation to that individual, you can define what the milieu is. So if you're talking about a crystal as a physical individual, then the milieu would be the solution out of which the crystal is formed. If you're talking about a living being, a vital individual, then the milieu is the environment in the sort of normal sense of the word, the set of resources that surround that individual, whether it's other organisms, sunlight, nutrients in the soil, etc. So the milieu is always defined in connection with the individual, and then so that raises the question, which I think you were sort of pointing towards, of if that milieu is always defined relative to the individual in question, then does that mean that this distinction between individual and milieu is itself something relative, that, or maybe to put the question in other terms, is there some sort of absolute reality of the distinction between the individual and the milieu? And I think the way Simondon would understand this is that the individual milieu pair is what has absolute reality. So it's only at the level of each particular pairing of individual and milieu has to do with a way of sort of cutting up reality. So we look at a particular pair of individual and milieu as being a physical individual or a vital individual or whatever, but that the pair of individual and milieu has absolute reality in the sense that it's not just a question of perspective of the observer that determines that reality. So it's not. So we can. There is a fact of the matter about whether a particular individual milieu pair is a physical individual or a vital individual, for example. So if I point to a particular portion of reality and I say this is a vital individual with its surrounding milieu, then I can be wrong about that. I can make a mistake. It could be the case that in fact this portion of reality is not a vital individual, and it's this capacity for correctness and error, I think, about which portions of reality are at which level of individuation, I think is what sort of constitutes the absolute value of this sort of level of individuation concept for Simondon. And then I think another sort of aspect of what you bring up has to do with, I guess, the question. So if there is this sort of relativity of the degree of individuation, or if the milieu is always relative to an individual, can we conceive of the whole of reality as one big milieu or as one big individual? And I think Simondon would say that neither of those options is valid, precisely because the notion of an individual and the notion of a milieu, each of them presupposes the other. So you can only ever have an individual in relation to a milieu, and likewise, you can only ever have a milieu in relation to an individual. So you can't conceive of reality as a whole as being one big individual, which is what he takes Spinoza to be doing. And you also can't take reality as a whole to be one big milieu, which would be a sort of, opposite of Spinoza, I guess. But either way, you are sort of only grasping one aspect of reality without the complementary aspect. So I think, I think that idea of everything would just be milieu, there would be no individual. I think that's sort of how Simondon would answer that question.
So your explanation gives like a much clearer idea on this. That I think that's the distinctive points which is different from Spinozian idea about the world. So firstly, like I think Simondon is trying to say kind of how to zoom in like the world, then you can see like the world like or I mean different individuals, like different process of genesis. And the secondly, as you said, that's neither Milio nor an individual. Instead, of what Simondon tried to emphasize is that it's not the set in advance by God as a one kind of the world. It's not just a stable or defined or decided world. Instead, it keeps changing because like that's the, as far as I understand, that's the meaning of ontogenesis. So by continuing like interaction between every and each individual and their milieu, continuously we can see like unexpected something new, something unexpected, and then it overlaps and something like that, and then it makes something new again and again. So the process of the ontogenesis, like the process of generating a world, is continuously changing. I think that's the probably like the Simondon is trying to emphasize through his theory.
Yeah, this notion of ontogenesis, that's the other bit that I didn't sort of talk about in my response to your earlier comment. Yeah, so ontogenesis means that there's a new a production of something new, a new individual with its associated milieu out of something that was not previously an individual, and um, we we have to, I think, understand this as a historically or yeah, I guess historically determined concept in the sense that there was a time in the history of the universe in which there were no vital individuals. It's only after a particular um, moment in time that we find vital individuals in existence. So the vital level of individuation is something that only appears at a given moment in the history of the universe. And likewise with psychical individuation and so on. So we can we can understand each of these levels of individuation as an introduction of novelty into the universe. So there's a kind of existence that wasn't present before that now is present after this, first arising of this level of individuation. In that sense, ontogenesis is a kind of novelty or a kind of production of novelty. But then once there is such a thing as vital individuation, so once the first living beings arise in the universe, then the process of ontogenesis of living beings can be extended or repeated, and you can have more living beings, continue to arise in the history of living beings and the history of the individual.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, that's the end of that text analysis of the criteria of individuality. I think we can probably start on the next text, which is a good sort of segue from the analysis of the criteria of individuality, because he sort of introduces right at the end this notion of allegmatics, and then the next text is all about allegmatics. So we'll sort of learn a little bit about what this weird term actually means. So if someone would like to read the first page or so of Allegmatics, we can continue from there.
I can read Allegmatics, and there's a note from, I don't know if this is in the French or from the translator. This is notes on Allegmatics that have been preserved from Gilbert Simondon's preparatory manuscripts. Allegmatics is the theory of operations. In the order of the sciences, it is symmetrical with the theory of structures and is constituted by a systematized set of particular knowledges: astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology. Each branch of allegmatics cannot be designated by an objective domain, like the study of matter or the study of life. On the other hand, an initial but useful way to distinguish its specifications consists in using the already constituted sciences to denominate various intervals. Indeed, an interval signifies the possibility of a rapport, and a rapport implies an operation. In this way, we will obtain physicochemical allegmatics, psychophysiological allegmatics, mechanical thermodynamic allegmatics. But the drawback to this concrete nomenclature is that we may neglect certain operations that could be theorized if another principle of classification were to make their discovery possible. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to define the broad categories of operations and the different type of transformative dynamisms that objective study reveals, and then to try to classify these dynamisms according to their intrinsic characteristics. And perhaps the theoretical goal would be reached if a single fundamental type of operation could be defined that would include all particular operations as simpler cases. These degrees of simplicity would then define a hierarchy that would be a rigorous principle of classification. Should I read this next kind of long paragraph?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, let's read that one.
Okay. It is just as difficult to define an operation as it is to define a structure other than by example. However, since a structure is given as the result of a construction, it can be said that the operation is what makes a structure appear or what modifies a structure. The operation is the ontological complement of the structure, and the structure is the ontological complement of the operation. The act contains the operation and the structure at the same time. Furthermore, depending on the side of the act we focus on, the act retains the operation element or the structure element by leaving its complement aside. Thus, while the geometer traces a line that is parallel to a straight line through a point taken outside the latter, the geometer focuses in the totality of his act on the structural element alone that interests the geometrical thought, i.e., the fact that a straight line is being traced in a certain relation with another straight line. Hence, the structure of the act is the parallelism of a straight line with respect to another straight line. But the geometer could also focus on the operation aspect of his act, i.e., the activity by which he traces, without being preoccupied with what he traces. This activity of tracing possesses its own schematism. The system to which it belongs is an operative system, not a structural system. Indeed, this activity proceeds from a volition that is itself a certain mental activity. It supposes the availability of a certain energy that is free and controlled by mental activity throughout all the links of a chain of complex conditional causalities. The execution of this activity involves an internal and external regulation of movement in an operative schema of finality. Thus, geometry and allegmatics take divergent paths from the very beginning of their activity. This idea of the geometrical structure, especially the straight line, being thought in terms of its being drawn, reminds me of the idea of the schematism in the first critique. And well, I can't remember if that's in the schematism or not, but for Kant, whenever we think of a straight line, we have to draw the straight line, which I guess is kind of the point of the schematism, which is just that any concept has to be applied to the intuition in time.
Yeah, there's an interesting bit. Actually, it comes up I think a couple of times in the first critique. But his theory of mathematical knowledge. So for Kant, we have mathematical knowledge not just through concepts, but through the form of intuition, which is a sort of mysterious bit. Or there's the sort of one of the footnotes where he talks about the form of intuition and formal intuition. So we have geometrical knowledge, for example, because we know that our intuition has the external form, has the form of space, and so we acquire geometrical knowledge not just by analyzing, say, the concept of a triangle. So he says if you just take the concept of a triangle and sort of analyze that concept, you can never extract any real knowledge out of it. But if you actually draw a triangle and then you draw the auxiliary lines as in any Euclidean demonstration, then you can deduce properties such that the interior angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles. So you can actually just see that relationship after you draw the lines. So of course, if you look at a physical drawing, you would, this would be an empirical property. You would, trace certain lines on paper or on a chalkboard or whatever, and then, take a protractor and measure the angles. And, given that this is a physical drawing and not a sort of ideal geometrical figure, you would find that the angles are maybe not exactly equal to two right angles, or the lines are not perfectly straight or whatever. But what Kant has in mind is a kind of ideal drawing. So we can in our use of our knowledge of the form of intuition, or our so this is where the sort of difficult bit about the formal intuition comes in, is that we have to be able to sort of intuit the relations that constitute the form of intuition. So it's not just that intuitions have the form of external sense, namely space, but we also have to be able to intuit those relations themselves in our sort of construction of geometrical figures. So we can form a kind of ideal triangle and then intuit what the relations of these angles in the triangle are. So Kant yeah, so he gives these examples of drawing a line as being sort of the simplest instance of an act of synthesis. So to grasp the unity through time of the subject, so the fact that I exist as not just an entity that has a sort of momentary existence, but I persist through time, or I am capable of grasping the unity of something at time A and time B. So his sort of image of how this is possible, or of the synthesis through which this is possible, is the act of drawing a line. So our our sort of grasp of space, or sorry, our grasp of time is mediated through something like the act of drawing a line, where we attend not just to the line that is drawn, or sort of we ignore the line itself that is drawn, but we attend to the act of drawing the line itself. And so it's this act of drawing the line that we're sort of paying attention to, and not the result of that act. And so Simondon here is pointing to this sort of two-sided nature of the act. So we can pay attention either to the result of the act, or the act insofar as it produces a particular structure as its result. So that's the structure side of the act. And then we can also attend to the act insofar as it's an operation, so insofar as it's bringing about the structure, and not attend to the structure itself. And so he's here in this text, he's dividing sciences, or any sort of intellectual operation, or any intellectual domain, into like the domain of structure and the domain of operations. And Allegmatics is his name for the science of operations, or the intellectual inquiry into operations as such. And another, maybe a small point of translation here, is that in the first bit where he says Allegmatics is the theory of operations, in the order of the sciences, it is symmetrical with the theory of structures, and is constituted by a systematized set of particular knowledges. It should instead of saying "and is constituted," it should say "which is constituted." So it's the theory of structures which is constituted by astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. It's not Allegmatics. So Allegmatics is always sort of between the existing sciences, which is, as he explains in the next bit. So you could have an Allegmatics that's sort of between physics and chemistry, or between biology and psychology, for example. It would take the set of structures that biology studies, and sort of look at how they pass to the next one. Yeah, actually, that's interesting. So that's Spencer Brown, I believe, is the name of this sort of logician who tries to derive logic as a whole from this action of making a mark. This mark sort of divides the conceptual space into two. So you have one side of the mark, yeah, Spencer Brown. You have one side of the mark and the other side of the mark. And so you have the act itself, and then you have the result of the act, which is this mark that divides space into one side of the mark and the other side of the mark. And so yeah, this sort of taking the this complementarity of the act and the result of the act as like the sort of universal principle for dividing sciences. I think that's sort of what Simondon is working with here. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I know, Angus, you have to leave. Maybe we can just go on a little bit past when Angus has to leave, just so we can get a little bit further into the text, and then we'll maybe read one more section and then go from there. So do we have any volunteers to read the next bit?
I'll do it. I could press the button. So, by the way, where we are?
So we are at perhaps we could nevertheless attempt.
Right. Perhaps we could nevertheless attempt to grasp encounters in which the very act is grasped simultaneously as operation and as a structure. These privileged and exceptional cases take on both a normative and a metaphysical sense. They are axiotological, These cases include Descartes' cogito or main de Behance volo in the cogito. The act of thought is grasped objectively as a structure and subjectively as an operation. The more thought doubts its own structural existence, the more this operation of doubt grasped as a structure. For example, objective reality facing reflexive thought presents itself to the thought as an existence of which one cannot doubt. The oscillation of doubt, which is a reflexive alternation, allows for the act of thought to be grasped simultaneously and identically as an object and as a subject. The evidence of the existence of thought. The Cartesian hypothesis of the evil genius is merely a means for increasing this necessary oscillation by making the subject aware of the twofold situation of his thought with respect to himself. Sometimes grasped as object, sometimes as subject, sometimes as the structure of an operation, and sometimes as an operation as on a structure. The second negating subject of the evil genius plays the role of resuscitating the oscillating instability of self-consciousness by creating a reflexive consciousness of this instability. Forced to think himself not just with respect to himself, but also in his rapport to the evil genius. The subject grasps himself as if he became exterior and superior to the twofold situation he occupies with respect to himself. He becomes a reflexive subject by taking, in order to resist the evil genius, the point of view not just of the subject being or the object being, but of the being of the act of thought, which the attention of a consciousness decomposes into operation and structure. Demoniacal negation endows the subject with the consciousness of its act and of his being. Mengde elicited the same fundamental truth in the ordeal of the volo. Here, negation is provided by an exteriority that is no longer the exteriority of an other hostile subject, but of an inert world that exists by revealing its reducible alterity in this way. These two ordeals are the same. They are the ordeal of an act, and insofar as the act identified with the being, they take on a signification as a principle and point of departure. They provide an ontology and axiology because they give the knowledge of first reality to the subject. Since this reality is known absolutely, the success of this act of knowledge provides the paragon of eminently valid knowledge. The knowledge of first reality provides a criterion of a truth. We have stop here?
Yeah, let's stop here. This is a kind of a dense text, so let's read maybe shorter bits as we go along. Right, so here we can connect this with the discussion in volume 1 in Psychical Individuation, when he talks about the doubting doubt and the doubted doubt, if you remember that passage. So in the Cogito, we can see this act. We have this sort of complementarity of the action or the operation and the structure in the act of the cogito, or in the act of doubting. So as I doubt whether or not I exist, I at the same time that act of doubting is itself something that is certain, is a structure that is sort of incontrovertible. So and then at the same time, I can take each instance of that act and then put it into doubt itself. So at any given moment, I can doubt that my previous action of doubting exists or was real, but each moment in which I perform that act of doubt is itself is an operation that is sort of immediately convertible into a reality. So there's this this convertibility in the act of the cogito between the operation and the operation and the structure in the act of doubting. And then so he points out here this hypothesis of the evil demon or the evil genius. It looks like there's a difference of translation, but this demon who makes me think that 2 + 2 = 5 or whatever. This entity that makes me that Descartes supposes as sort of the principle that allows me to doubt everything. So this entity brings about this what he calls the oscillating instability of self-consciousness. So the subject is capable of grasping himself or itself as something that is subject to oscillation. So it's not just that as an entity I act in this oscillating manner. So this I'm sort of wavering between two options. Is 2 + 2 = 4 or 5? I'm not sure. So I have this oscillation in my activity, but then I also, as a subject, I'm capable of grasping this oscillation, so I can become aware of my doubt. And in that act of becoming aware of my doubt, or in this act of grasping my oscillation, I produce something that is certain or that is not subject to further oscillation. So I in the act of doubting or in the act of becoming aware of my own action, I produce this fundamental existence of myself. This I think I exist, which is true whenever I assert it. So it's this act of thought that is this sort of immediate convertibility of operation and structure. It's that that constitutes the reality of the subject or the being of the subject. So it's not just the subject is not immediately equivalent to the operation, but the subject is the equivalence of the operation and the structure, or the convertibility of operation and structure.
Actually, I don't know exactly what Descartes how Descartes defines like a evil genius, but what I thinking over the serpent in the serpent and then Adam and Eve, it has like a process of human being become conscious of their existence, and then how it is exposed to the world. Things like that comes to my mind regarding the identity of evil genius. So secondly, what you explained, the doubts is like the process of at the same time as you explained, it's kind of a process of self-conscious of their own existence, like by doubting, like we can just like realize that we just hear something like that's the like a meaning of doubt, right? Like by Descartes.
Yeah.
I mean,
to start with sorry.
Oh, sorry, kind of consciousness of subjectivity, like, but the word is not the only subjectivity, but also we the evil genius, the role of the evil genius is like make us realize other than us there are others, and the other so-called like Milio or other kind of objects still at the same time exist, something like that. Is that right way you understand this part?
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the way that Simondon presents it here is a bit different than that. I think the role of the evil demon or the evil genius is to sort of force the subject to perform that act of reflection. So without the evil spirit, evil genius, whatever you want to call it, without this entity, I might sort of rest at the level of mathematical truths. So in the order of the meditations, Descartes starts by doubting the senses. So he says, I acknowledge that sometimes I'm mistaken. So I see a stick in the water and I think it's bent, and then I take it out and I realize that it's actually straight. And he says, because it's my senses are not trustworthy, I'm going to doubt everything that the senses tell me. But then he says, there are certain mathematical principles that I acknowledge as being necessarily true. So, that a square has 4 sides, or 2 plus 2 equals 4, or anything simpler, if there is such a thing. These sort of fundamental mathematical truths, he finds himself unable to doubt, and it's at that point that the evil spirit intervenes. So he says, the evil spirit is sort of he supposes that the evil spirit is an entity that sort of makes me mistaken every time I try to count the sides of a square, or that makes me make a mistake every time I try to add 2 plus 2. And so it's only because this entity is sort of introduced into the picture that I can actually bring mathematical truths into doubt. And then it's by doubting everything, including mathematical truths, that I grasp my act of doubting itself, or doubting insofar as it's an act of thinking, as this sort of immediate convertibility of operation and structure, as something that is at the same time that exists insofar as it acts. So it's only because I can doubt everything, including mathematical truths, that I sort of perform this reflexive act, and so grasp myself as an entity that exists insofar as it thinks. So that's the role of the evil genius, is to sort of force us to go beyond things, even to doubt things that seem certain to us.
Yeah, that's
And I don't.
really. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Really very, very helpful, because it directly connected to last line of the part I just read, and then could provide the criterion of the truth, as you explained, in a way, gives me some the imagination of the dimensions. The world is not just 3 dimensions; it could be more than multidimensional. And then what Simongdong is focusing is in the world that could be, as you said, beyond the human senses, there could be more truth we don't know. We don't perceive. We can't perceive things like that. That's the role of the evil genius. Here, right?
Yeah, I think, the evil genius forces us to sort of relativize our what we take to be certain. So even though I can't, on my own, I can't doubt that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's something that's so immediately obvious to me that I can't doubt it. If I suppose that there is this evil genius that is somehow capable of making me make a mistake every time I try to add 2 plus 2, then I can take even things that seem immediately certain to me or immediately obvious to me. I can put even those propositions into doubt, and so I can treat even things that I take to be immediately certain. I can take that immediate certainty itself to be something subject to doubt, and I think that's the role of this evil genius, is to allow me to doubt things even when I take them to be immediately certain. Um, and so this means that I can suppose that something that I find immediately certain might, someone else might find it doubtful, or someone else might find something different to be immediately certain. So I can imagine that someone else might say, 2 plus 2 equals 5 is something that is immediately certain, and that they have no doubt, or they can't conceive of a doubt about this proposition. This sort of imaginary picture of the evil genius is what allows me to bring up the possibility that other kinds of immediate certainty might be possible for other beings. So yeah, like in your example, other beings might immediately be certain that there are 4 spatial dimensions and not 3, or something like that. So it's something that makes my immediate certainties, or the things that I find myself unable to doubt, makes those propositions relative to me, as opposed to sort of absolutely valid certainties.
Thank you so much. Yeah, much clearer. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next little bit. Let's see. No, I don't want to go that far. So yeah, I'll read about a page or so, and then we'll discuss from there, and then call it a day after that, I think.
Sure.
Okay. However, even after a similar point of departure that seems to want to privilege neither the operative aspect nor the structural aspect of being, the thought of Descartes as well as the thought of Biran deal with structure on the one hand and operation on the other. To a certain extent, morality remains definitively provisional in Descartes, since it cannot strictly correspond to a structural science that remains unfinished. And Biran, through a leap into the world of pure operation, defines the hierarchy of three lives by abandoning the point of view of psychophysiological unity within which the ordeal of the effort was situated. The lack of a coherent scientific theory of morality in both the work of Descartes and Biran is due to the fact that they were both working before the emergence of sufficient conceptions of advanced structural sciences. The science of operations can be attained only if the science of structures becomes aware of the limits of its own domain from within. Allegmatics is the operative side of scientific theory. To this day, science is only half completed. It must now formulate the theory of operation. Nevertheless, since an operation is a conversion of a structure into another structure, there would first need to be a systematics of structures for this work to be achievable. Cybernetics marks the beginning of a general allegmatics. The program of allegmatics, which seeks to be a universal cybernetics, consists in formulating a theory of operation. But it is impossible to define an operation apart from a structure. Consequently, the structural system will be present in the definition of operation in its most universal and most abstract form. And to define the operation will amount to defining a certain convertibility of operation into structure and of structure into operation, insofar as the operation effectuates the transformation of one structure into another structure, and is therefore invested with the previous structure that will be reconverted at the end of the operation into the following structure. The operation is a métaxieux, or middle ground between two structures, and yet its nature is unlike that of any structure. Thus, we can predict that allegmatics will have to define the rapport of an operation to an operation, and the rapport of an operation to a structure. These first type of rapport can be called transoperative, and the second type can be called conversions. I'll stop here. Right. So he talks about how both in Descartes and in Biran we have this first moment. So the cogito in Descartes, where there's this immediate convertibility of operation and structure. And then after that first moment, you sort of separate the two and you focus on one side, so structure or operation. So you sort of develop one side. And Descartes, of course, focuses on the structure side where he developed his physics, his theory of the universe in terms of mechanical causation. And then he, on the side of operation, he gives his what he calls this provisional morality. So he says that ultimately we would want to have a system of morals that would be a sort of consequence of our understanding of physics, our understanding of the nature of the human being, and so on. But since we are living in an era where this system of science is not completed, we have to have a sort of provisional morality in the meantime. So a sort of morality for the period in which science is not yet completed. And Simondon points out that this sort of provisional morality is in effect definitive, or since science will never in fact be completed, we will always be in the realm of this provisional morality. But Descartes doesn't really develop this side of the operation as opposed to the structure. So he writes several books on the structure of the world, on the physics and so on, but he doesn't develop in any detail the side of the provisional morality or the side of the operation. And then Simondon goes on to identify allegmatics or to connect allegmatics as a sort of science of operation with cybernetics. And so he says allegmatics would be a universal cybernetics. So he thinks, as we'll see later on, he thinks that cybernetics is too restricted in terms of the types of operations that it allows. So cybernetics for him focuses on the operation of feedback, whereas allegmatics would be a more general study of operations and not just the feedback operations. And this more general or universal version of cybernetics is what allegmatics would be.
Wow, it's quite interesting. So kind of like then Simon Dong emphasizes like operation, right? A theory of operation. That's distinctive point, right?
Yeah, so he takes it that science, as it has developed up to his time, has focused on structure, and now the task is to develop a science of operation as the sort of complement to the science of structure. And so he takes it that cybernetics is sort of the first attempt or the first beginning of this science of operation, but the task now is to go further than cybernetics or develop a more universal science of operation that goes beyond the level of just feedback operations and is more general than cybernetics.
Yeah, right.
And then he goes on to talk about what kinds of relationships between structure and operation we can find. So we have operation and operation. So you can have a relationship between two different operations. And he calls this kind of relationship transoperative. And then you can also have a relationship between an operation and a structure, and he calls this a conversion. And we'll see more about what the relationship between transoperative relations and conversions is going to be. We'll see that in the rest of the text. So we want to sort of look at higher order construction, so operations of operations and operations between operations and structures. We'll sort of develop this hierarchy of different nested levels of operations and structures and see how they relate to each other.
Yeah, so we are going to stop here, right? By doing that, we can remember what we did today, and then makes next session much more interesting.
Yeah, so I think this is probably a good place to stop for now, because then the next bit is where he starts to develop the theory of operations and so on. And then we should be able to finish this. Maybe not. Yeah, we can try to finish this text next time. I'm not sure if we'll be able to, but yeah, let's try to finish this text next time. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out. I hope to see you next week, and we'll try to finish this text.